My husband said he was in therapy. I followed him and found the mother of a dead boy. Original fictional Reddit-style story for narration. My husband has been going to therapy every Thursday evening for 5 years. At least that is what I believed. His therapist's name was supposedly Dr. Miriam Vale. She didn't accept insurance, insisted on cash payments, and held her appointments in a private office across town. I never questioned it. Therapy seemed to help him. Before he started going, Daniel barely slept. He would wake up sweating, check the windows, and sometimes walk outside at 3 in the morning just to make sure our car was still in the driveway. After a few months with Dr. Vale, the nightmares became less frequent. He started laughing again. The man I had married slowly returned, so I respected his privacy. Then, 3 months ago, I discovered that Dr. Miriam Vale didn't exist. And when I followed my husband to his appointment, I found him sitting across from an older woman whose son had died in an unsolved hit-and-run 17 years earlier. My name is Leah. I'm 33, and Daniel is 35. We met 9 years ago through mutual friends. He was quiet, thoughtful, and almost painfully careful around other people. He apologized when someone else bumped into him. He returned shopping carts even in heavy rain and remembered the names of people's pets. Daniel wasn't perfect, but he was kind in ways that never seemed performative. We married 3 years after meeting. The first time I saw the other side of him was during a road trip about a year into our marriage. We were driving through a small town where Daniel had grown up. On the way out, we passed a roadside memorial, a wooden cross surrounded by faded flowers. Daniel saw it and immediately stopped speaking. A few minutes later, he pulled the car onto the shoulder. His hands were shaking so badly that he couldn't remove them from the steering wheel. He said he couldn't breathe. I called emergency services because I thought he was having a heart attack. The doctors later told us it had been a severe panic attack. When I asked about the memorial, Daniel said a boy from his school had died on that road. He didn't provide any details. 2 weeks later, he told me he had found a therapist. Every Thursday at 6:30, Daniel left the house. His session supposedly started at 7 and lasted about an hour. He was usually home by 9. He never talked about what happened during the appointments. I didn't push him. I knew therapy only worked if a person felt safe, and I wanted to be the kind of wife who respected that. The only strange detail was the payment. Every Thursday, Daniel withdrew $180 in cash. He said Dr. Vale didn't accept cards. That felt old-fashioned, but not impossible. We could afford it, and whatever she was doing appeared to be helping him. For 5 years, Thursday evenings became part of our routine. I made dinner for myself. Sometimes I watched a movie Daniel didn't like. When he returned, he would shower, put his clothes directly into the washing machine, and sit quietly for the rest of the evening. I assumed the sessions exhausted him emotionally. Looking back, I should have questioned the shower. I should have questioned the cash. But when someone you love gives you an explanation that fits, you don't always search for one that hurts more. The truth began unraveling because of our mortgage. We were refinancing our house, and the bank requested several financial documents. While reviewing our expenses, the advisor noticed the weekly withdrawals. She asked whether they were related to a medical treatment that could be documented. Daniel wasn't home, so I said yes and offered to find the receipts. That evening, I asked him if Dr. Vale could provide a payment summary. Daniel's reaction was immediate. He said therapy records were confidential. I explained that we didn't need treatment notes. We only needed receipts confirming the payments. He said he would handle it. A week passed. When I asked again, he became irritated. Daniel rarely raised his voice, but that night he accused me of turning his mental health into an accounting problem. I apologized. Still, something about his reaction stayed with me. The next day, I searched for Dr. Miriam Vale. There was no website, professional profile, or licensing information. I tried different spellings and searched nearby cities. Nothing. I called 3 practices with similar names. None had heard of her. When I confronted Daniel, he said Miriam Vale was the name she used professionally and that her practice was intentionally private. I asked for an address. He said he didn't remember the exact number. After 5 years of weekly appointments, that was the first moment I knew he was lying. I wish I could say I confronted him directly and demanded the truth. Instead, I searched his desk while he was at work. I'm not proud of that. Inside the bottom drawer, beneath the old tax documents, I found a small appointment card. There was no business logo, no qualifications, no telephone number, only a handwritten address and the words, Thursday 7 p.m. Don't be late. I entered the address into a property database. The house belonged to a 62-year-old woman named Margaret Ellis, not Miriam Vale. I searched Margaret's name. The first result was a newspaper article from 17 years ago. The headline read, Family Appeals for Information After Teen Killed in Hit and Run. The photograph showed Margaret standing beside a smiling 18-year-old boy named Owen Ellis. He had been struck while walking home from a graduation party. The driver had never been identified. The accident happened in Daniel's hometown, on the same road where he had experienced the panic attack. I read every article I could find. Owen had left the party sometime after midnight. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, another driver found him beside the road. Investigators believed he had been hit by a dark-colored car. Fragments of a broken headlight were recovered, but no matching vehicle was ever located. Owen and Daniel had attended the same school. They were in the same graduating class. Daniel had never told me the dead boy's name. I spent the next 6 days moving through my own house as though it belonged to someone else. Every familiar object felt staged. Our wedding photographs, Daniel's shoes beside the front door, the coffee mug that said, World's Okayest Husband. I tried to create explanations that didn't make him dangerous. Maybe Margaret was a grief counselor using a different name. Maybe she held an unofficial support group. Maybe Daniel felt guilty because he had been at the party and hadn't walked Owen home. But none of those explanations accounted for the fake therapist, the cash, or 5 years of lies. The following Thursday, I followed him. Daniel left at 6:20, carrying the same brown envelope I had seen him prepare every week. I waited 2 minutes before leaving. Margaret's house was in an older neighborhood on the far side of the city. I parked half a block away and watched Daniel walk to the front door. Margaret opened it before he knocked. She had gray hair pulled into a loose knot and wore a dark sweater. She didn't smile or greet him. She simply stepped aside. Daniel entered. I waited in my car for nearly 20 minutes before getting out. The curtains were mostly closed, but a narrow gap remained beside one window. I stood behind a hedge and looked inside. Daniel was sitting at a kitchen table. Margaret sat across from him. Between them was a small audio recorder. Behind Margaret, the wall was covered with photographs of Owen, school photographs, holiday photographs, a picture of him holding a guitar, another of him standing beside an old blue bicycle. Daniel placed the brown envelope on the table. Margaret didn't touch it. She switched on the recorder and said something. Daniel lowered his head. I couldn't hear the words through the glass, but I could see his face. He looked terrified. I must have shifted or made a noise because Margaret suddenly turned toward the window. She looked directly at me. I froze. Margaret stood, walked out of the room, and disappeared from view. Less than a minute later, the front door opened. She stepped onto the porch and called my name. Leah, she said, you may as well come inside. I had never met this woman. Hearing my name and her voice was more frightening than anything I had seen through the window. I considered running back to my car. Instead, I followed her inside. Daniel was standing beside the table. The moment he saw me, all the color left his face. He asked why I was there. Margaret answered for me. She finally stopped believing you. Daniel looked at the recorder, then at me. I asked who Margaret was. He said nothing, so Margaret told me. My son's name was Owen, she said. Your husband was with him the night he died. My knees felt weak. I sat down at the table. Daniel remained standing. He kept repeating that he could explain, but each time I asked him to do it, no words came out. Margaret sat across from me. She told me Daniel had appeared at her door 5 years earlier, 3 days after his father's funeral. At first, she hadn't recognized him. Then he said he had information about Owen. Daniel claimed he had been inside the car that struck him. According to the story he gave Margaret, Daniel's cousin Miles had been driving. Both of them had been drinking at the graduation party. They saw Owen walking beside the road. Miles swerved toward him as a joke. The car struck Owen before he could move away. Daniel said he begged Miles to stop, but Miles continued driving. They brought the damaged car to a repair shop owned by Daniel's father. The headlight was replaced, the hood was repaired, and the vehicle disappeared several days later. Daniel's father gave both boys an alibi. When investigators questioned them, They said they had left the party early and spent the rest of the night at Daniel's house. Miles died from an overdose 3 years after the crash. Daniel's father kept him silent for more than a decade. Then, after his father died, Daniel drove past Owen's memorial and experienced the panic attack I had witnessed. That was when he contacted Margaret. I asked why she hadn't immediately gone to the police. Margaret said Daniel's confession had been incomplete. He refused to put anything in writing. He claimed he didn't know what happened to the car and couldn't prove that Miles had been driving. Margaret believed that if she reported the conversation too early, Daniel would deny it and disappear behind his family's lawyers. So she made him an offer. Every Thursday, he would come to her house and answer questions about that night. She would record everything. When Daniel was finally ready to provide the location of the car or other physical evidence, they would take the recordings to the authorities together. The weekly cash payments weren't for therapy. Daniel had offered Margaret money as restitution. She refused to use it, but accepted the envelopes and placed them unopened inside a safe. She said every dollar would eventually be donated in Owen's name or submitted as evidence. I looked at Daniel. He was crying silently. I wanted to feel sympathy. Instead, I thought about the hundreds of Thursday evenings when he had returned home and allowed me to believe he was doing something brave for his mental health. I asked why he had called Margaret his therapist. Daniel said it was easier than explaining the truth. Margaret laughed when he said that. It wasn't a joyful sound. 5 years, she said, and he still calls lying easier. I asked whether that was everything. Daniel said yes. Margaret said no. She moved the recorder closer to me. Then she pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the kitchen. The recording was from an earlier session. Margaret was asking him to describe the seconds before the collision. Daniel said Miles had been laughing. The radio was too loud. Owen turned toward the car when he heard the engine. Margaret asked where Daniel had been looking. Daniel answered, "I looked down to change the radio station." There was a pause. Then his recorded voice corrected itself. "I mean, Miles looked down. Miles was driving." Margaret stopped the recording. Daniel said it had been a mistake. Margaret played another section. In it, Daniel described the impact. He said he had felt the steering wheel twist in his hands. Again, he corrected himself. He claimed he meant that he had seen Miles struggling with the wheel. There were dozens of moments like that, small slips, details a passenger might not have experienced. The pressure of the brake pedal, a crack across the lower corner of the windshield, blood on the driver's sleeve. Margaret believed Daniel had been driving. I asked him directly. He denied it. I asked again. He swore that Miles had been behind the wheel. Margaret reached into a folder and placed a photograph on the table. It showed Daniel and Miles standing beside a dark-colored car at the graduation party. The driver's door was open. Daniel was leaning against it with the keys hanging from one finger. A handwritten message was visible on the back. Daniel finally got his dad to let him drive the Beaumont. "We're all going to Owen's party." Daniel stared at the photograph. Margaret said she had received it from one of their former classmates 2 months earlier. The Beaumont belonged to Daniel's father. Daniel was the only person allowed to drive it. Miles didn't even have a license. That night was supposed to be Daniel's final session. Margaret had planned to confront him with the photograph and ask for the truth. Instead, I had arrived. I asked Daniel one last time, "Were you driving?" He sat down. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the clock above the kitchen doorway. Then he said yes. He had been drinking, but he insisted he wasn't completely drunk. Miles had dared him to frighten Owen. Daniel accelerated and moved the car toward the side of the road. He expected Owen to jump away. Owen turned too late. After the impact, Daniel stopped approximately 100 yards farther down the road. He wanted to go back. Miles told him that Owen was probably fine and that returning would destroy both their lives. Daniel drove to his father's repair shop. His father examined the damage and immediately understood what had happened. Daniel begged him to call for help. His father said it was already too late. He replaced the broken headlight and cleaned the car before sunrise. The next morning, they learned Owen had died. Daniel said he tried to confess twice. Each time, his father threatened him. He said Daniel would go to prison, his mother would lose the house, and the family business would collapse. He told Daniel that telling the truth wouldn't bring Owen back. A week later, the car was moved. Daniel claimed he never knew where. Margaret asked him to stop lying. Daniel looked at her and finally admitted that he knew. The car had been hidden inside a storage building on land once owned by his grandfather. After Daniel's father died, the property passed to a distant relative who had no idea what was inside the locked building. The car was probably still there. Margaret switched off the recorder. She told Daniel they were going to the authorities the following morning. Daniel nodded. Then he looked at me and asked if I would come home with him. I couldn't believe he had asked. He had just confessed to killing someone, leaving him beside the road and lying to me for nearly our entire marriage. Still, some part of him believed we would get into the same car and return to our normal life. I said no. Daniel reached for my hand. I moved away. Margaret told him to leave. He walked out without another word. Through the window, I watched him sit inside his car for several minutes. Then he drove away. I stayed with Margaret until almost midnight. She showed me the envelopes Daniel had brought. Everyone was labeled with a date. None had been opened. She showed me 5 years of recordings. Daniel had spent hundreds of hours describing the same night from different angles. At first, I thought Margaret had been punishing him. Maybe she had, but she said punishment wasn't the reason. She needed Daniel to become more afraid of the lie than he was of the truth. I asked how she knew my name. Daniel had talked about me during the sessions. He described our home, our wedding, and the life we were building. Margaret said he often used me as evidence that he had become a good person. He wanted me to believe that loving you canceled out what he did to Owen, she said. Those words broke something inside me. I had unknowingly become part of Daniel's defense. The next morning, Daniel returned to Margaret's house with a lawyer. Together they gave the recordings, photograph, and storage building location to investigators. A vehicle was recovered from the property 2 days later. I won't share details about the ongoing case. I have been interviewed, and I provided every document and financial record I could find. Daniel and I are separated. I haven't decided what our future looks like, although everyone around me seems to think the decision should be obvious. Maybe it is obvious, but knowing what someone has done doesn't instantly erase the person you knew. I still remember Daniel sitting beside my hospital bed after an operation, refusing to sleep because I was frightened. I remember him caring for my mother during chemotherapy. I remember thousands of small acts of kindness. Now, every memory ends with the same question. Was he kind because he truly cared, or because he was desperately trying to prove that he wasn't the person who left Owen beside the road? I don't know. Perhaps both things can be true. That might be the hardest possibility of all. Update. It has been 4 months since I originally wrote this. The investigation is still active, so there are many details I cannot discuss. Daniel has accepted responsibility for being the driver. He is no longer claiming that Miles caused the collision. He wrote me a letter. I almost threw it away, but eventually read it during a session with my own therapist. Daniel said he spent his entire adult life dividing himself into 2 people. One was the frightened 18-year-old who drove away. The other was the husband, employee, and neighbor who tried to be good enough to bury him. He said the Thursday meetings were never therapy because he wasn't trying to heal. He was trying to suffer in a controlled way. As long as Margaret questioned him each week, he could feel punished without facing consequences he couldn't control. Even his confession had been another form of hiding. I haven't answered the letter. Margaret and I have spoken several times. The money from Daniel's envelopes remains untouched. She plans to use it to create a road safety scholarship in Owen's name once the case is resolved. She gave me a copy of the last recording. I didn't understand why until I listened to the final few minutes. The recording continued after Daniel left the kitchen. It captured a conversation between Margaret and me. I was crying and telling her I felt foolish for believing him. Margaret answered, "Trusting someone you love isn't foolish. The shame belongs to the person who used that trust as a hiding place." I have replayed those words more times than I want to admit. I filed for divorce last week, not because I believe Daniel was incapable of love. I filed because love cannot survive when one person has been turned into evidence for the other person's innocence. For 5 years, I thought my husband went somewhere every Thursday to become healthier. In reality, he went there to visit the life he had stolen, and then returned home to the life he had built on top of it. Margaret once asked him what he remembered most clearly about the night Owen died. Daniel said it wasn't the impact. It wasn't the broken glass or his father cleaning blood from the car. It was the moment he looked into the rearview mirror. Owen was lying beneath the orange light of a street lamp, growing smaller as the car moved away. Daniel said he had been watching that image disappear for 17 years. The difference is that now, finally, he has stopped driving. Optional narrator outro. Could you remain married to someone after discovering a secret like this? And do years of genuine kindness matter when an entire relationship was built around a lie? Share your verdict in the comments and subscribe to Thread Echo for more dark confessions and unsettling internet stories.